everybody, it's Angie Marchese. I am Vice President of Archives and Exhibitions here at Graceland in Memphis, Tennessee. And we're actually here in the music room to talk Elvis and the Ed Sullivan Show. We chose this room in particular because the TV behind me is the oldest television that we have here at Graceland. And it was probably the same one that Elvis's parents watched when Elvis appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, September of 1956. I know you guys threw a lot of questions out online, so we're going to start doing a simple kind of Q&A and show you some documents and some items we have here from the collection. So if you're ready, let's start.
Okay, Angie, we've had several questions come in about the clothing that Elvis wore on the Ed Sullivan Show. Tell me a little bit about where that clothing is, if it's still around, and what it was like.
So the clothes Elvis wore on the Ed Sullivan Show, a lot of it came from a local clothier, Lansky's Brothers, down on Beale Street. Unfortunately, none of it resides in our collection here at Graceland. There is some of it that's in some private collections around, but none of it resides in our collection. That was one thing that when we first started doing research and we started looking into this project, that I started doing some photo research, just hoping we could photo match some things, but we weren't able to. So, but he did buy a lot of it locally at Lansky, so stayed with the hometown clothier.
But we do have one thing in our collection that appeared on the show that's sitting
next to me.
you.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the guitar.
So when Elvis first appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, he used his Martin, and he used that for his first and second appearances. For his third appearance, this guitar made its debut. It's a 1956 Gibson J200. Elvis used it not only on the third Ed Sullivan Show, he also used it in the movies Jailhouse Rock, Loving You, and King Creole. And then he had it refurbished in 1961. They changed the pick guard and they added his name to it. And he continued to use this guitar his entire career. It's the oldest guitar in our collection, and it did make one of its debuts on the Ed Sullivan Show.
So we had another question come in asking, why didn't he sing Heartbreak Hotel?
You know, it's really interesting. At the time when Elvis appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, Heartbreak Hotel had already been released, had already gone gold, had gone to #1. So the Ed Sullivan Show gave Elvis the opportunity to sing and record and promote other songs that he was doing. In fact, some of these documents here actually talk about songs that Elvis was going to sing on the show. This document is dated September 25th, 1956. And as you read, it says that we want to do the new recorded title, Any Way You Want Me, and also a new novelty tune, Paralyzed. So they were really trying to get Elvis's music out there, especially the new stuff. And of course, on his first show, he did the cover song for Love Me Tender, the film he was making at the time when he appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time. So he was promoting his movie as well as his music. But Heartbreak Hotel had already been #1 for so long that they were trying to do some new stuff.
Another great question is, why didn't Elvis ever use a microphone on the Ed Sullivan Show?
You know, that's interesting because on other shows he did. It really was the setup in the studio. It was all the mics and all the sound came from the rafters, so there was no need for Elvis to have a microphone on stage. But it really was depending on the studio setup. Now, when Elvis was on the Sullivan Show, his first appearance was actually filmed at CBS Studios out in California. And then the last two were actually at the studios in New York. But it was all the setup in the studio why he didn't use the microphone.
So another question that came in was, what was Elvis's pay for the performance?
This is interesting. This is actually, he made $50,000 for 3 appearances. But this is the actual 1956 employer tax records from the Ed Sullivan Show, stating that in 1956 they paid Elvis $33,333.32. And they held out in federal income tax $5,995.40 and paid $84 in FICA taxes. So out of the $50,000, $33,000 of it was for the first 2 appearances in 1956, and the rest was for his January 1957 appearance.
So another question came in about a guest that was on the show. They ask, is it true that Carol Burnett was a guest the same night as Elvis? If so, did Carol and Elvis meet?
You know what? That is such a great question because she was. The January 57 show, not only was Elvis the star of the show, but some of the other guests that were on there was Carol Burnett and Lena Horne. I can only imagine that they did cross paths backstage. And Elvis, being the Southern gentleman, would definitely have gone up and greeted Carol Burnett. I figured that that would be somebody that he would have admired and appreciated her comedy. So there's no actual record of them actually meeting, but I can only imagine since they were on the same show, they probably crossed paths backstage.
Another question that came in was, I know Ed Sullivan didn't originally want Elvis on the show. What made Ed Sullivan change his mind?
Now, that's a good question because Ed Sullivan actually said publicly that Elvis wasn't fit for family entertainment and, quote unquote, was not his cup of tea. And then in July of '56, Elvis appears on one of the rival shows, the Steve Allen Show. And that night was the first night that Ed Sullivan lost in ratings to one of his competitors because Ed Sullivan had the #1 show on TV. So just a few days later, we have a telegram dated July 12th. This is actually between Harry Ketchum at William Morris Agency and Colonel Tom. And in it, they talk about the Sullivan deal. So Ed has now realized that even though Elvis might not be his cup of tea, he is good for ratings. And so that they were going to try to get a deal done so that Elvis could appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. Also working around Elvis's movie obligations and other obligations they had already had at the time. So it literally was Steve Allen beating Ed Sullivan in the ratings that actually, pushed Sullivan to have Elvis on his show.
Okay, another question that came in was, is it true that Elvis received his polio vaccination live on The Sullivan Show to encourage teenagers to get the vaccine?
That's really interesting because he did receive a polio vaccination. It wasn't live on the show, but it was backstage. It was very photographed and very promoted because it was a way of letting the teenagers and young adults know that they needed to eradicate this disease and that Elvis was getting his polio shot, so it was cool for you to do it too. So yes, that did happen at the Sullivan Studios in New York.
So Elvis was on the Ed Sullivan Show 3 times. Why not a 4th? Why not a 5th?
That also is a good question. It wasn't because of lack of wanting him there. After Elvis's 3rd Ed Sullivan appearance, Elvis goes and he gets drafted into the military. And so he films his movie, King Creole, and then he's off into the Army. So to celebrate Ed Sullivan's 10th anniversary of being on TV, they actually reached out to have Elvis appear on the show. But unfortunately, Elvis was serving his country in the Army, and he was stationed in Germany at the time. So there was time, they were just never really reconnected where there was a perfect time for Elvis to be back on the show. Elvis did send a telegram when the Beatles appeared on the show, welcoming him to America. But so Elvis and Ed and Colonel all remained friends throughout the years, but never really kind of hooked up on TV again.
So what other items from the archives do you have to show us today?
Some interesting things. One thing that I found fascinating is that Elvis appeared in Tupelo, Mississippi on September 26, 1956. This was his homecoming show. And this is actually the press release regarding the show. And it states on it that unfortunately there will be no television cameras or no television allowed at the show because of Elvis being under contract with Ed Sullivan. And the only person who could change this was Mr. Sullivan himself. So Elvis agreeing to be on the Sullivan Show also kind of hindered other shows from having him on television. So I thought that was really cool. Another thing is that if anybody ever wondered what room Elvis stayed at in the Warwick Hotel, here is actually a copy of Elvis's room receipt, and the room number's in the upper corner. It's room 1716 to 1718 at the Warwick Hotel in New York. We also have several checks paying for hotel stays at the Warwick. That was Elvis's go-to hotel when he was in New York. Oh, and the other interesting thing, he checked in under his character's name from Love Me Tender, Clint Reno. I thought that was kind of fun. He actually flew under that name too when he went to New York. And then we've got his local American Federation of Musicians tax receipt, because when Elvis was appearing in New York, he did have to pay local taxes to the American Federation of Musicians. This is for his appearance in January of '57 on the Ed Sullivan Show, and it came to $39.26. And let me see what other fun things we have here. Oh, Elvis was on his way home from the Ed Sullivan Show on a train, and he cashed a check in Shelbyville for $50. Needed some money in his pocket on his way home. So I thought that was kind of cool. What's really cool on the back is you can see all the stamps of all the places the check got routed before it got to Memphis. So that's a lot of banks it went through. And it also is signed by Elvis, which is also really cool. But yeah, and then we've got some checks, weekly paychecks given to Elvis's band members, DJ Fontana, Scotty Moore, and Bill Black. These are all for the week of work ending January 12th, 1957. So this would be for his last appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. And they're all for $100. And then here is a check to the Warwick Hotel for $446 to cover all of their stays. So out of the money that Elvis made for the show, not only that wasn't money that Elvis cleared, that was money that Elvis used to pay expenses for the guys, for the band, for their travel, for their stay, for everything. All that came out of Elvis's part of the money. So.
All right, do we have time for one last question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we got lots of questions about the songs that Elvis actually played on the show, but the specific question is it true that Ed did not want Elvis to sing a gospel song?
Now, that's very interesting because everyone has always heard that Elvis wanted to sing a gospel song on his final show. In fact, the last song he sings on his final appearance is Peace in the Valley. What's interesting is that we found in the archives this letter. It's dated January 3rd, and it says, Mr. Elvis Presley. It says, Dear Elvis, we have advised Mr. Sullivan that you are going to be doing the following songs on his show Sunday, January the 6th. When My Blue Moon Turns to Gold, Too Much, and Paralyzed. When the Colonel went to New York to discuss the setup with Mr. Sullivan for your appearance on Sunday, Mr. Sullivan thought it might be very appropriate for you to sing a hymn or a semi-religious song on the show. This would be in addition to the 3 you've already scheduled and if time is permitting. You certainly can sing a hymn very effectively, and I think it would make a very strong impression on the viewers. It has also been suggested by Mr. Sullivan that the hymn be Peace in the Valley, which, as we all know, that's the song that Elvis sang at the end of the show. So it's quite interesting that that request actually came from Ed Sullivan and not Elvis's request, which is what has been folklored all these years. So that's just a quick look at some of the stuff here in the archives. I hope you guys have enjoyed talking about the Ed Sullivan Show. I've enjoyed it, refreshing my mind on several facts. I hope 60 million people tune in and watch this like they watched Elvis the first time he was on Ed Sullivan, or at least 82% of the viewers. But yeah, I hope you guys have a great time, and we will see you guys here in Memphis and see you at Graceland real soon. Bye.